Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today, Friday, October 28th, episode 125. Today's episode is pre-recorded, so sadly we're not going to be able to take questions or comments at the end, but it's always good to have you with us. If you do have questions or comments or events you want us to announce on the show, please feel free to reach out. You can always send those to info@intobeing.com. That's info@in2being.com. We'd love to hear from you. Today we'll talk about upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem. We'll also talk about FDA news. And I got to tell you, it's the recalls that are always the most fascinating, because when you look closely at them, they tend to teach you something about what we should understand as a product development and product delivery community. So we'll get into those in just a second, but the news that you'll be hearing about after the local events: FDA's new least burdensome guidance for deficiencies. So when the agency reports deficiencies to you and me, there's a way they should be doing it. Why does it help to know that? Well, it helps us to understand how we can respond to the agency, what we can hold them to, because they've laid that out in a guidance that's very new. And after all these years, how can there be a heating pad recall in 2022? These things have been around forever. How on earth could it be that over 200 adverse events, shocks and sparks and more coming out of heating pads sold at Walmart and Amazon? And it may not seem related, but we're going to be talking to you about RFID interference, a product design from Baxter and Hillrom that made it to market but has this potential to shut down or modify the behavior of all sorts of in-hospital electronic products. Not a good thing. But believe it or not, these two news items actually have an amazing regulatory similarity we'll be talking about in just a second. Then it's on the A list. Guess what? FDA has targets for 2023 that they want to issue guidances on. So if any of these things are of interest to you, good news. Of course, there is a B list also, and if it's on that, well, we're not going to hold our breath. And finally, there's some new information on clinical decision support software guidance from the agency. So we'll tell you all about this and more in just a moment. But first, upcoming events. November 1st, happening at Ford Field, the MedHealth Summit. It's going to be a great event where the Michigan community is getting together. We're going to be broadcasting live with a couple of podcasting partners from this event all afternoon. We'll be live at Ford Field. We'll have interviews with some of the speakers there and coverage of the kinds of things that are happening with the event. But you don't need to watch it online. You can come and be part of that at Ford Field. November 1st, the MedHealth Summit in the Hall of Legends. November 2nd and 3rd, MD&M Minneapolis is happening. So if you're looking for vendors for your product development efforts, MD&M is always a great place to show up. Scan that code to find out how to get there. Then November 7th and 8th, the Joint Public Workshop for Medical Devices for Opioid Use. If you're engaged in thinking about how do we treat the opioid epidemic, this would be a great virtual workshop to show up for, put on by none other than the FDA. And November 7th through 9th, in Columbus, Ohio, the Combination Products Summit. We've been telling you about this for the last month. Dr. Nagin and Dr. Weiner are going to be at this. You can get office hours time with them. If you are an attendee of this summit, you can get 15 minutes on their calendar during the day. That is a pretty good deal. FDA is coming back to these kinds of events, and it's so good to have them there. November 14th and 15th, there's a Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Summit hosted by Midas. We found out about this through the Weil Institute at University of Michigan. Bunch of local groups involved in that. Scan the QR code to get involved if you're interested in data science and artificial intelligence. Then November 14th through 17th, we'll be at this along with the delegation from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation at Medica in Dusseldorf, Germany. It's a major healthcare trade show. and the state of Michigan is bringing a delegation. We will be there with that delegation, talking all about the state of Michigan's amazing resources for medical and life science product development. Then on November 17th, Medical Extended Reality. This is a new one. Applications and Challenges. It is a lecture by Ryan Beams, who is a physicist and a program coordinator with the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories at CDRH, at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So if you're interested in how augmented and virtual reality technologies can be used, as well as how do we think about this from a regulatory standpoint, Dr. Beams will be talking all about that on November 17th. Scan the QR code to get connected to that meeting. Then on December 6th, the FDA's Broad Agency Announcement Day for 2022, when the FDA announces all the things that it's looking for collaboration on. This isn't something you submit to FDA so that you can get clearance on your product. This is a place where you can go and help them work on the kinds of problems that they're interested in. Well, those are the announcements for the rest of 2022. On to FDA and industry news for the local and national ecosystem. And as I mentioned before, we're going to start with these new least burdensome guidance, I should say, for deficiency letters. So when FDA comes back with a deficiency letter for a 510K, for a de novo and the like, least burdensome is nothing new. FDA has been using this language for years. They want to be least burdensome. And it's not like they haven't said what they mean by that in the past. Ever since 1997, this type of language was added to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. They were amended again with the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act and the 21st Century Cures Act. Now, if you want to go directly to the guidance that we're talking about today, you can scan that QR code that's right there on the screen. But as a refresher, least burdensome, like we said, is nothing new. It's a principle that the FDA has had at least since '97. It's things like this: only request information that is necessary. Sounds good. The least burdensome appropriate means of evaluating device effectiveness that would have a reasonable likelihood of resulting in approval. Sounds good language, but it's a little hard to understand what it means. The least burdensome appropriate means necessary to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of device safety and effectiveness. Now that does really sound good, but what does it mean and how do you go about it, or how would you ever hold the FDA to it? Consider the role of post-market information in determining the least burdensome means of demonstrating a reasonable assurance of device safety and effectiveness. Again, it sounds great. Minimum required information. Sounds good. We don't want FDA asking for more than they're entitled to. But how does it actually get implemented? How do you know what you can say to the agency if you feel that they're not doing the right thing here? So FDA has actually taken a step, and while it's not a large one, it's a modestly important one. Because in this guidance, they talk not only about how a company might want to respond to a deficiency with recommended structures and content, but they also talk about what should or should not be in a deficiency letter. And while this doesn't dramatically move the needle, it does provide one additional layer of information so that you, going to the agency, have an idea as to how you might respond to them. Let's look at some of these examples. The agency says that information unrelated to the marketing authorization decision should not be part of the decision-making process. If you've ever worked with the FDA, you know that there's many times when they express their opinions and their preferences, and when they would really rather see something that would be very helpful for them and their learning. Well, that's great, but if it doesn't relate to the marketing authorization decision, in other words, if they wouldn't say no without this information, it shouldn't be included. Or it should be included elsewhere, not in the deficiency letter, through some other request for information, but not one that is technically a deficiency. So this is actually good. They're saying only include things in the deficiency to their own people that would actually need to be part of the decision-making process. If you have other interactions you want to have with the company, that's fine, but have them elsewhere. They also say that alternative approaches to resolving regulatory issues should be considered to optimize the necessary time, effort, and resources involved in developing a response. Now, actually, that's still quite a vague statement, but since it's applied to the topic of a deficiency letter, it does give you something that you can respond to FDA with. You can go back to them and say, we think there's an alternative approach. What do you think? They also say that deficiencies should request the minimum amount of information necessary to adequately address the identified issue in the most efficient manner at the right time. And explicitly they say consider the balance between pre-market and post-market information. Now this is really nothing new when considered in light of the least burdensome provisions, but now reduced to the level of a deficiency letter. If FDA is not considering potential post-market solutions, I think it's now our ability to go to them and say, you have guidance that says you should have considered this. We'd like you to consider this possibility of some post-market surveillance. Also, the totality of information necessary for evaluating the benefit-risk profile of the device, as well as uncertainty in making the best risk-benefit determination, should be considered. They know that these are not cut and dried matters, and this is an open door to argue benefit risk in the context of specifics in a deficiency letter. Major deficiencies, normally the FDA would put forward major and minor deficiencies, but they want things called major deficiencies only if they would preclude a favorable marketing authorization. So in other words, if FDA wouldn't say no, they shouldn't put it in as a major deficiency. Now, hopefully this has always worked out well, but it certainly gives a little bit of ammunition if something is placed in a deficiency letter without the explicit understanding that if you don't do it, you won't get your clearance or your authorization. So while this doesn't represent a sea change from the least burdensome provisions, it does give us some nuance and some specifics as to how we should expect to see deficiencies going forward. And additionally, minor deficiencies don't really belong then in a deficiency letter. They would rather now that the agency, that the reviewers address minor deficiencies in an interactive manner, to not even put them in a deficiency letter and put them in front of the company. And then finally, they may include recommendations, suggestions, etc., that are not expected to preclude a favorable marketing authorization. They do not require an applicant response. Wow, for every time you've ever seen in a deficiency letter, we recommend that. Now the FDA will be under a little bit more burden to make it clear whether that recommendation is one that will preclude an affirmative decision or whether it's just one that they would like to see and you can address if it's convenient for you. So again, not a sea change, but something that's really cool to see the FDA doing for these deficiency letters. Hopefully it'll result in better clarity. And if you are in process with the FDA, just know that these new guidances are out there, that they're there for the reviewers. There's also recommendations in there for your company, how you respond to the agency. It's pretty basic stuff. Restate what the agency said and provide your data and your response. But nevertheless, worth a look if you're in the middle of interacting with the FDA. And this one came as a little bit of a shock after all these years A heating pad recall? I mean, who doesn't remember being a kid and having that heating pad put over your head or neck when you were feeling bad? I mean, that was just such a event of my childhood. And yet, on October 24th, 2022, this company, Wheel, announced a recall of over 500,000 Mighty Bliss electric heating pads distributed between July 2021 and July 2022 through Amazon and Walmart. This is 500,000 heating pads that were put through the major retailers in the US. Now, just as a public service, here is the exact models that are part of that recall. This is not necessarily germane to what we'll be talking about today, but if you did happen to pick one of these up, please take a look at that table right there so that you can know to get rid of it. The recall procedure is listed in the recall. Oh no, we might not have a QR code, which would be a major deficiency here. Hopefully it's not a major deficiency. But if you go to the FDA website, this is actually right on their front page of their medical devices tab. These are the pads under recall. They actually tell you to cut the cord and to send them a picture of the destroyed device. They're that worried about it. Because of this, 286 complaints related to the product overheating, sparking, burning, or presenting other electrical problems. This is something you just shouldn't be seeing with something like a heating pad. 31 of these complaints reported injuries such as mild shocks, burns, rashes, or irritation. That's really tragic. But for the point of today's show, why? How on earth in 2022 do we have an electrical medical device sold through major retailers burning, shocking, and otherwise harming in 286 cases? Because if you look, they're registered with the FDA as a Class 2 medical device under this product code. They even have Intertech testing on their label. This is great. Looks all wonderful, doesn't it? They even cite that it conforms to UL standard 130 for this heating pad. But that's where it starts to get interesting, because as it turns out, UL standard 130 is not even recognized by the FDA. It's not clear whether other standards were conformed to or not. And when you dig just a little bit deeper, it turns out that this is one of the product codes that FDA exempts from 510K submission. Let's unpack what that means. FDA says that the device is exempt from the pre-market notification procedures. That means that Wheel, the company that put the device on the market, didn't have to submit to FDA for clearance for this device type. And that's by design. There have been many product codes that FDA has exempted from the 510K process, and many more that FDA has even moved from Class 2 to Class 1 to reduce the burden of getting to market. But here's the hidden loophole. For as convenient as that is for companies getting devices to market, and for as much as it's still a given company's responsibility to conform to applicable standards, it remains the case that at no time in this process does it appear that anyone would have ever checked or needed to check on behalf of the consumer that the appropriate standards, such as 60601 for patient contacting medical electrical systems, was followed. So again, we don't know exactly what standards were complied with. We don't actually know where the problem is. We don't know if it was a design problem, something that should have been caught in testing. We don't know if it was a manufacturing error. So we're not going to guess on those. But the reality is that the loophole here is that at no point did any entity other than the company have to go in and check whether the correct standards were followed. So it remains to be seen where the error actually occurred. So, good idea, bad idea? Is it good that the FDA has exempted devices like this that plug into wall power and sometimes drape over your body? That these are exempt from any kind of scrutiny pre-market? Yeah, it's true that the FDA would eventually get around to auditing a company like this, but they weren't required to be checked prior to going to the market. Is this a good idea? A bad idea? Well, I know when we're trying to get a device to a market, it's nice to have fewer regulations. But when we're using a product, it's nice to know that somebody checked it out. And while the full story isn't out, we may well find that that work hadn't actually been done. So we'll leave that for the student to ponder, but there's another example to follow on its heels. RFID interference, a growing trend and a growing problem in the medical device space. This, the WatchCare Incontinence Management System, it's an electronic pad that goes on the bed that is not even wired, and it helps to alert to bedwetting, to incontinence. This put out by Baxter. It's this pad here, but it's not just this pad because this pad has no wires going to it. It's also the system that communicates wirelessly to this pad to query whether any moisture has made its way to the pad. And this is used, this uses RFID technology, radio frequency ID technology. And you say, what's the worst that can happen? RFID, I know about that. I've got a card in my wallet that's got RFID technology in it. I've got this lanyard that has the technology in it. I've got something that lets me look for objects. What could go wrong? Well, it turns out that it's not the passive tag that you're concerned about. It's the antenna that is associated with it. And the more passive that tag is, the stronger that antenna and transmitter needs to be. That means every time we've got an RFID situation, we're pumping radio frequency out into the environment. Here are some of the things that can happen specifically from this recall. FDA says that insulin pumps and blood glucose sensors can be affected and result in overdosing of insulin. Be vigilant of any erratic or incorrect glucose levels or insulin dosing events. As nice as it is to be warned, that's a pretty serious event. Fetal monitoring and Doppler may cause phantom incorrect fetal heart tone readings, up to 200 beats per minute. So now you don't know whether your fetal monitor is recording the baby's experience or it's just something erratic from this bedwetting monitor. Telemetry devices, artifacts of unknown specificity, bladder scanners, interference of unknown specificity. Users should be vigilant of any potential false residual urine volume readings. And for infusion injection pumps may cause interference of unknown specificity. Be vigilant of any erratic or incorrect dosing events. But again, it could be too late by the time that happens. Here's what's happening with systems like this. You have RFID antennas that are placed in the bed but not connected to the pad. And as we can read at this article by Eisner Safety Consultants, the FDA has been insisting that medical device, IVD, and even implanted medical device manufacturers meet this particular AIM standard 7351731 for RFID immunity testing. So FDA is requiring this. And it turns out that FDA has consensed this standard ever since 2018. So it has been out there, it has been understood. But get this, The test level for this standard is nearly twice the test level for the general medical electrical safety standard that's in use widely in the industry. This means if you happen to overlook this little fact and you don't happen to grab the right standard, which would be relatively easy to do in this situation, you might not test for enough RF immunity. Why would anyone do that? Wouldn't the FDA check that? Wouldn't somebody say something that the company was testing to the wrong standard? Well, not if the device is exempt from 510(k) clearance. And here we are again. This one is. So while it is the company's responsibility to make sure that the right standards were tested to, and while we cannot say what standards the company did and did not test to, so again, this could be a manufacturing issue, it could be a design issue, it could be something that should have been caught in testing. We cannot place blame as to exactly where this occurred. But nevertheless, just showing this loophole, because this device did not require a 510(k) for clearance, there's nobody who pre-market will say to the company, hey, you picked the wrong standards there, or hey, did you notice that the standard electrical safety testing isn't the level of scrutiny that FDA has been requiring for the last few years? It turns out what FDA has been requiring is double that in the other consensus standard that most people are used to using. And so here's another example. Good idea, bad idea? Well, it really depends. For the company that wants to get the device to market and is doing a very conscientious job, it's great to not have a 510(k) required. But for the consumer that could find themselves getting the wrong dose of insulin or some other drug simply because of a bedwetting alarm gone awry, this might not come across as a very happy omission on the part of the agency to not require a 510(k) for this. Again, time will tell, these things will work out in the wash. But would it be good to have somebody asking, did you get all the right standards? Again, that's something that whenever conscientious developers are working, they try to do, they try to get in there. But ultimately, should the agency be involved? Should they be asking this question? Two examples from the same week where the answer might be yes. We'll leave that for you to think about as you ponder how these devices are cleared. Next up, the A list. It's usually a good thing to be on. And if the things that you're interested in are on FDA's A list, congratulations, topics that FDA is focused on for guidance in 2023. There's also a B list, which we won't focus on, but we're not going to hold our breath if it's on the B list. FDA intends to issue final guidance for the following topics: remanufacturing of medical devices, a transition plan for medical devices that fall within enforcement policies issued during COVID-19, transition plan for emergency use authorizations, cybersecurity in medical devices, quality system considerations, and content of pre-market submissions. That should be a big one. Content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. Fostering medical device improvement, FDA activities and engagement with the voluntary improvement program. Breakthrough devices, always a hot one. And draft guidances. The previous ones were final guidances that they intend to issue. These are draft ones. Voluntary malfunction summary reporting. Clinical considerations for medical device pre-market submissions targeting opioid use disorder. Remember that that's a working meeting coming up from FDA on opioid use devices. Select updates for guidance for the Breakthrough Devices program, and an electronic submission template for de novo request submissions. So, should be some cool stuff coming out of the agency in 2023. Can't wait to get into the details with you in future weeks. And then finally today, Clinical Decision Support Software Final Guidance. There was an FDA webinar held October 18th. Scan that first QR code if you'd like to go see the materials from that webinar. The content is going to be very similar to what we covered on MedTech Crossroads episode 122 on clinical decision support software, which you can get to through the second QR code on the screen there. We talked all about FDA's approach to clinical decision support software. In their new webinar, they talk a little bit more about the background of how they got to where they are today. But as always, the focus is really on this question: is your software a device? This chart, which we covered in episode 122, as well as this zoom in on the chart, is one of the most important things that you can be looking at. If your software function doesn't acquire, process, or analyze medical images, signals, or patterns, does it display, analyze, or print medical information normally communicated between healthcare professionals? Does it provide recommendations, information to an HCP rather than to provide a specific output or directive? And does it provide the basis of recommendations so that the healthcare professional does not rely primarily on any recommendations to make a decision? Then it may be clinical decision support software. So it's all about, does your device qualify as a device, or does your product skirt through these loopholes such that it can be clinical decision support software? Here's the guidance that both our time on episode 122 and also FDA's webinar is referring back to. The clinical decision support software guidance for industry, and I hope you enjoy that. If you are trying to create software that you don't want to have to get cleared, but you do want to have out there helping healthcare professionals do their job better. Well, that's it for the news today. The least burdensome guidance, heating pad recall, RFID recall, but both related to the same issue potentially. Potentially both related to the fact that neither of these devices needed to have FDA clearance. So in good faith, it was the company's job to make sure that they designed and tested and manufactured this according to standards. Did they? Where did the problem come? Jury's out. But nevertheless, the fact that these did not have to be examined by FDA for a 510K left an open loop where it may be that the standards were not followed. Then the A list for topics for guidance for 2023 and the FDA webinar on clinical decision support software. And you can reach all of those here. You can always get to MedTech Crossroads on YouTube. Just look up MedTech Crossroads. You can get to it through IntoBeing's page as well at intobeing.com. I'm sorry today is a pre-recorded show, so we can't take your questions, but we'll look forward to being back with you live next Friday, yes, but even before then, next Tuesday, November 1st, at the MedHealth Summit at Ford Field. All afternoon we'll be broadcasting live with our podcasting partners. We'll be bringing that to you live next Tuesday, so be sure to pop onto YouTube, and we'll look forward to seeing you there as we talk to the guests at the MedHealth Summit. Thanks, and have a great day.